The air at the Northern Climb Warfare Center had teeth. It bit at the sliver of exposed skin between Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova's watch cap and the collar of her utility uniform. She stood motionless on the frozen asphalt, her sea bag at her feet, watching the other Marines of Victor Company hustle between the long, low barracks. They moved with the hurried energy of men who knew the cold was a patient enemy, always waiting for a moment of inattention. Her arrival was a quiet disruption. A few curious glances, a few dismissive smirks. A female gunny just shy of 40, assigned to a cold-weather infantry unit for their final certification exercise. To them, she was a checkbox, a social experiment, a liability waiting to happen. The conflict was already plain. They saw a woman, she saw a mission. The turning point would not be a conversation. It would be the wind, the ice, and the silent, unforgiving judgment of the mountain. For now, she was just a statue in the biting wind, another shadow in the long afternoon light. She felt the weight of their assumptions settle on her like a second pack. Rostova had learned long ago that the most formidable walls were not made of brick but of prejudice. She picked up her bag, the motion fluid and economical, and walked toward the administrative building. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and wet wool. A lance corporal with a fresh face and tired eyes looked up from his computer. Gunny Rostova, reporting as ordered, her voice was low, devoid of inflection. He fumbled with a stack of papers. Ah, right, Gunny. They've got you in Platoon 2. Barracks B. Sergeant Gallo is your platoon sergeant. He pointed vaguely out the window. He's around somewhere. The dismissal was casual, almost unconscious. She was just another piece of personnel to be processed. Rostova gave a single, sharp nod and turned. She didn't need a welcoming committee. She needed a gear manifest and a terrain map. As she stepped back into the cold, she saw a knot of Marines huddled near Barracks B. One of them, a sergeant with bulky shoulders and a swagger that seemed immune to the temperature, watched her. Gallo. He nudged the man next to him, and they shared a low laugh. Rostova's eyes swept over them, cataloging faces, assessing postures, before moving on. The first test wasn't the mountain. It was this, the quiet, insidious challenge of being underestimated. She found her assigned rack, a metal frame with a thin mattress, and began to unpack with methodical precision. Each piece of gear was inspected, placed, and memorized. Her Arctic issue gloves, thick and heavily insulated, were placed at the foot of the bed, ready for the pre-march inspection. The next morning, the entire company was assembled in a cavernous briefing hall. The air hummed with nervous energy. At the front of the room, Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before a massive satellite map of the Adirondack training area. Thorne was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains he trained his Marines to conquer. He had a reputation for being demanding, traditional, and deeply skeptical of anything that deviated from the corps he had joined 30 years ago. He paced before the map, his voice a low rumble that filled the room. They call this exercise the Winter Serpent. It is a 72-hour march through the most unforgiving terrain this state has to offer. There is no room for error. There is no room for weakness. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, they seemed to pause on Rostova. He didn't use her name, but everyone knew who he was talking to. We have new attachments to the company for this exercise. Let me be clear. Standards are not adjusted. The pace will not slow. The weight of the pack is the same for everyone. Every Marine will pull their weight, or they will be a liability to the man on their left and their right. We are not here to accommodate anyone. We are here to build war fighters. The condescension was a palpable force in the room, a cold more piercing than the wind outside. The Marines around Rostova shifted, a few shooting her sideways glances, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They wanted to see if the colonel's unspoken prediction would come true. Rostova met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She simply listened, her mind already walking the route on the map, calculating caloric needs, identifying potential bivouac sites, and noting the forecasted drop in temperature. His words were just noise. The mountain was the only voice that mattered. Rostova spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, focused observation. While other Marines joked and boasted, she moved through the company area like a ghost, her eyes missing nothing. She watched Sergeant Gallo's platoon, noting the casual cruelty in the way he spoke to his junior Marines, the bravado that masked a deep-seated insecurity. She saw a young private, Chan, struggling to waterproof his boots, his fingers clumsy with cold and inexperience. She watched another, Lance Corporal Diaz, shiver uncontrollably after a short period outside, a sure sign of poor circulation that could become a serious problem. She studied the environment with the same intensity. The way the snow drifted against the eastern walls of the buildings told her the prevailing wind direction. The color of the sky, a flat, washed-out gray, promised more snow, heavier than the flurries they were currently experiencing. The snapping sound the frozen tree branches made was a clear indicator the temperature was dropping faster than the official report suggested. She returned to her own gear, her focus absolute. She field-stripped her rifle, wiping every component bone dry before applying a thin coat of graphite lubricant that wouldn't gum up in the extreme cold. She repacked her medical kit, adding 2 extra chemical heat packs and a small, tightly rolled vapor barrier liner. She checked the straps on her snowshoes, reinforcing a stitch she didn't like. Every action was deliberate, a conversation with a future self who would not have time for mistakes. Her expertise was a quiet hum beneath the surface of her stoicism, a detailed and intricate knowledge of survival that was, as yet, completely invisible to the men who judged her. They saw a woman checking her gear. She was rehearsing a victory. The pressure began to build before the first mile marker. The winter serpent began under a sky the color of lead. The light flurries had intensified into a steady, driving snow that swirled in hypnotic patterns, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. The wind howled through the passes, a physical force that stole breath and warmth. Colonel Thorne's voice, crackling over the radio net from his command post, was tight with tension. All elements report status. Maintain interval. Watch your sectors within 2 hours. The exercise had devolved from a test of endurance into a battle for control. The younger Marines, who had been full of bravado in the warmth of the barracks, were now silent, their faces grim masks of discomfort. The cold was a relentless thief, draining energy, numbing fingers and toes, and planting seeds of doubt in their minds. Panic began to simmer. A fire team got separated in the whiteout, their frantic calls over the radio betraying their rising fear. The company corpsman was already dealing with 2 cases of severe frostnip. The methodical pace of the march was breaking down. Men were stumbling, their movements becoming clumsy and inefficient as their bodies prioritized core warmth over limb function. Sergeant Gallo's voice was sharp, laced with anger as he berated his Marines to keep up. It was the sound of a man losing his grip. Rostova, positioned near the rear of the 2nd platoon, remained an island of calm in the growing chaos. She had discovered the theft just before they stepped off. Her gloves were gone. A quick, silent search confirmed they hadn't been misplaced. They had been taken. She felt a flicker of cold anger, but immediately suppressed it. It was an operational problem, nothing more. She had pulled 2 pairs of thick wool socks from her pack, pulled 1 pair over her hands, and wrapped the cuffs of her uniform tightly around them with parachute cord. It was a poor substitute, but it was a solution. She focused on her breathing, on the rhythm of her snowshoes, and on the welfare of the men around her. The cold in her hands was a dull, persistent ache, a tactical reminder of her vulnerability, and she managed it like any other threat. The crisis struck at dusk. The column had halted in a windswept valley to establish a hasty perimeter for the night. The temperature had plummeted. It was then that Lance Corporal Diaz collapsed. He didn't cry out, he simply folded, his body giving up the fight. He was semi-conscious when they reached him, his breathing shallow, his skin a waxy, pale color. The corpsman, a young sailor named Petty Officer Reyes, rushed to his side, his own movements slowed by the cold. "I need a shelter. Get him out of the wind," he yelled, his voice strained. Marines scrambled to erect a small tent, their frozen fingers fumbling with the poles. Gallo stood over them, shouting useless orders. "Move, damn it! Get him inside!" Inside the cramped tent, Reyes cut away Diaz's sleeve. The kid's hand was bone white, hard to the touch. Severe frostbite, maybe deep tissue. He's hypothermic. We need to get him warm now. Reyes's hands were shaking too badly to effectively manage his medical kit. Rostova knelt beside him. She didn't ask for permission. She acted. "Give me your kit," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. Reyes looked up, surprised, but handed it over. With precise, efficient movements, Rostova took control. Get his wet layers off. All of them, the other Marines, stunned into obedience, followed her commands. She sliced Diaz's uniform open with a trauma shear. "Chun, get my pack." The side pouch Chun, the young private she'd seen struggling with his boots, scrambled to obey. Rostova pulled out the vapor barrier liner and the extra heat packs. "We create a hypothermia wrap. Barrier against the skin to trap moisture, then sleeping bags. Put the heat packs on his neck, armpits, and groin. Major arteries her hands, protected only by the damp wool socks, were red and raw, but they were steady. She worked without wasted motion, her actions a masterclass in field medicine. Gallo and the others watched from the tent flap, their mockery forgotten, replaced by a stunned silence. They saw her improvised hand coverings, saw the raw skin beneath, and then saw the undeniable, life-saving competence with which she worked. Her skill was a rebuke far more powerful than any words could ever be. A profound shift occurred in the frozen valley. The whispers that had followed Rostova around the base ceased. In their place was a grudging, confused silence. The Marines of 2nd Platoon, especially Gallo's clique, looked at her differently. They saw her moving around the perimeter, checking on the men, her hands now wrapped in fresh strips of fabric she had cut from a spare t-shirt. The pain must have been immense, a constant, burning fire in the sub-zero air, yet her face remained a mask of placid concentration. She had not only endured the sabotage meant to break her, she had ignored it in the service of saving one of their own. Lance Corporal Diaz was stable, cocooned in a mountain of sleeping bags, his life pulled back from the brink by her swift, decisive action. The incident had been relayed up the chain of command. In the warmth of the command post miles away, Colonel Thorne stared at the radio speaker. The report from the company commander was clear. Gunny Rostova had taken charge of a critical medical emergency, improvising solutions and performing flawlessly under extreme pressure. Thorne's brow furrowed. It didn't fit the narrative he had constructed. He had expected her to be the first casualty, the first one to request evacuation. Instead, she was the one preventing it. "What's her background?" Thorne asked his operations chief, his voice betraying a flicker of curiosity for the first time. "Standard infantry gunnery sergeant, sir. Drill field tour, couple of MEU floats. Nothing extraordinary on the surface." Thorne grunted, unconvinced. There was nothing standard about what she had just done. He looked at the map, at the blinking icon representing Victor Company, trapped in the belly of the storm. His assumptions were being dismantled, piece by piece, by a quiet gunny with frozen hands. The weather report crackled over the speakers. The blizzard was intensifying, expected to last another 36 hours. The exercise was over. This was now a survival situation. The situation deteriorated overnight. A low rumbling sound, felt more than heard, echoed through the valley. A pre-dawn reconnaissance team reported back, their voices grim. The primary route back to the extraction point, a narrow pass to the south, was gone. A significant avalanche had buried it under tons of snow and ice. They were trapped. Colonel Thorne's voice came over the command net, stripped of its earlier arrogance, now tight and clinical. "Victor 6, this is Dragon 6. Sit rep," the company commander laid out the facts. They were low on certain medical supplies, the blizzard showed no signs of breaking, and their only designated path out was blocked. "We are assessing alternate routes, Dragon 6, but everything on the map looks like a no-go. Too steep, too much exposure." A heavy silence followed. The men in the command post looked at the topographical displays, their faces grim. The alternate routes were death traps in these conditions. Back in the valley, the Marines huddled in their shelters, the news spreading quickly, fueling a quiet dread. In the command tent, Rostova was studying her own map, the one she had memorized. She ran a finger, wrapped in white cloth, over a series of contour lines. She looked at the wind direction, the snow accumulation patterns she had observed. She walked over to the company commander. "Sir," she began, her voice steady, "there is a possible route." Here she pointed to a high ridge to the west. "It's exposed, but the windward side should be scoured clean of deep snow. Less avalanche risk. It will lead us to the parallel valley, which offers a clear path south." The company commander looked at the map, then at her. "Gunny, that's a knife's edge. One slip and you're gone. It's not a marked trail. The mountain doesn't care about marked trails, sir," Rostova replied calmly. The commander patched her through to the command post. "Dragon 6. Gunny, Rostova has an alternate route proposal." Hesitantly, he relayed her plan. Thorn listened, his skepticism battling with the stark reality of their situation. It was a high-stakes gamble, a direct challenge to the established plan. But the established plan had failed. "Let me speak to her," Thorn commanded. "Gunny, you believe this route is viable?" "Affirmative, Colonel. It's our best chance." A long pause stretched over the radio. "Very well," Thorn said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Gunny, Rostova, you have the lead. Take them over that ridge." It was the ultimate second test. The lives of over 100 Marines now rested on her judgment. In the command post, Master Sergeant Grizz Miller leaned closer to his own monitor, a live feed from a high-altitude drone that was struggling against the storm to provide intermittent surveillance. Grizz was an institution, a man who had spent his entire career in the quiet, lethal corners of special operations. He was here as an observer for SOCOM, evaluating the exercise. He watched the tiny figures of the Marines begin their ascent of the western ridge. He focused on the lead element, a single figure breaking trail with an unervingly steady rhythm. The way they moved, the way they tested each footfall, the way they read the subtle shifts in the snowpack, it was all intensely familiar. "Colonel," Grizz said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the tension in the room. "Zoom in on their point man." The drone operator complied, the image sharpening for a brief moment. "Colonel Thorn," Grizz said slowly, his eyes wide with recognition. "Do you have any idea who you just put on point?" Thorn looked at him, annoyed. "A gunny sergeant named Rostova. She seems to know the terrain." Grizz let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sir, with all due respect, that's like saying a fish seems to know water. That's not just gunny Rostova. That's Kestrel." The name hung in the air, meaningless to everyone in the room except him. "Pull up her classified file," Grizz urged. "Restricted access, JSOC archives." "Call sign." Kestrel and aide scrambled to a secure terminal. Thorn walked over, watching as the clearance codes were entered. The file opened. His face went blank, then his eyes widened in disbelief. The screen was filled with commendations so heavily redacted they were almost unreadable. Mission locations were blacked out, but the environmental descriptors were clear: Siberian taiga, subarctic circle; Hindu Kush, high-altitude winter operations; Andean Cordillera, unassisted survival and evasion. This wasn't a drill field gunny. This was one of the military's most accomplished and secretive cold-weather survival experts. The woman he had dismissed, the woman whose presence he had questioned, had written entire sections of the very doctrine he was failing to execute. He looked from the screen to the drone feed, where the lone figure of Kestrel was methodically cutting a path to safety for his men. The full, crushing weight of his ignorance settled upon him. The return to base was a study in quiet exhaustion. Victor companies stumbled out of the blowing snow and into the relative sanctuary of the cantonment area, their faces covered in rime, their bodies aching. They were battered, but they were whole. Every single Marine had made it back. Rostova was the last one to cross the threshold into the company area. her eyes scanning the faces of the men she had led over the ridge, ensuring each one was accounted for. Her improvised hand wraps were frozen stiff, stained with blood from the constant abrasion against snow and ice. Her face was an impassive mask, betraying none of the pain, none of the triumph. As she walked toward the barracks, her path was blocked. Colonel Thorne stood waiting, his command staff arrayed behind him. The entire company, including a now stable Lance Corporal Diaz, had gathered, their expressions a mixture of awe and shame. Sergeant Gallo stood in the front rank, his head bowed. Thorne looked at Rostova, at her raw, bandaged hands, and then into her steady eyes. The chasm of his misjudgment was vast, and he knew words were inadequate to cross it. So he didn't speak. Instead, he drew himself to his full height, his posture rigid, and rendered the slowest, most deliberate salute of his career. It was a gesture of profound, unconditional respect. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, as one, Sergeant Gallo, Lance Corporal Chun, and every other Marine in Victor Company raised their hands in salute. They held the salute, a silent public admission of her strength, her courage, and their own humbling failure to recognize it. Rostova, her face unchanging, returned a single, crisp salute to the colonel, then dropped her hand and continued on her way. The gesture was all the acknowledgement she needed. Later that evening, the quiet of the barracks was a welcome reprieve. The storm still raged outside, but inside, there was only the soft sound of cleaning kits and the low murmur of tired voices. Rostova sat on the edge of her rack, meticulously disassembling her rifle. Her hands, now cleaned and properly bandaged by the base surgeon, moved with the same practiced, economical grace as before. The pain was a steady, throbbing baseline, but it was distant, a problem already managed and solved. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. On her neatly made bunk, placed precisely in the center of her pillow, sat a small box. Inside was a brand new pair of expedition-grade Arctic mittens, the best the military could issue, the kind reserved for special operations units. Beside the box was a single, folded piece of paper. It was from Gallo and the other Marines from his platoon. She knew without reading it that it was an apology. She didn't pick it up. She didn't even look at the box for more than a second. Her gaze was fixed on the bolt carrier group in her hands, ensuring it was free of any moisture, any imperfection. The presence of the gloves was a symbol of their changed perception, a token of the respect she had earned not with words, but with action. But the truth, which now resonated in the silent barracks, was that she had never needed them. Her strength was not in her gear, but in her will. The rifle clicked back together, a sound of perfect, mechanical certainty. Dignity and respect, once earned, were a warmth no cold could ever touch.